right now. Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the COP26 Climate Action Marathon presented by the Common Energy Impact Team. My name is Natalie and I'm coming to you from Ute Arapaho land in Denver, Colorado. For some general context, Common Energy is a community solar subscriber management organization which is accelerating the adoption of clean energy. And the Impact Team is our youth center collective of clean energy advocates. The purpose of the COP26 Climate Action Marathon is to promote discussion around the upcoming United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, which is actually starting next week, and also to increase awareness about climate mitigation strategies. The majority of this conference will be rooted in group discussion around our topic, and around 3:45 Eastern time, we're going to jump into a brief discussion about our work with community solar. So Lauren is going to send into the chat an attendance form. This is how we keep track of who's coming to our webinars and what kind of things people want to learn. So if you don't mind filling that out, that would really help us out. So without further ado, we'll jump into our topic. Today, we're going to be discussing the hot topics of COP26. This is the third event in our four-part series, and we have an incredible panel to join us in this conversation, including ocean policy expert Clea Harrelson and science communications specialist Rachel Ross. So because I want to leave ample time for our group discussion, I'm going to try to move as quickly as possible through our next few slides. Outline of what we're going to be doing today. First, we're going to talk about a little bit of context around COP26 and our international climate conferences. Then we're going to break down the major topics of this conference. Then we're going to go into our panel discussion, followed by a brief discussion about how community solar is a climate mitigation strategy. So first, for some basic background on our international climate conferences, these are all organized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was established in response to the first report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1990, which recommended that we reduce our emissions by 60% compared to current 1990 levels. COP is an acronym that stands for Conference of Parties, and this is an annual event where global leaders gather to discuss climate action and emissions reduction. I'll go through, so today we're going to be talking about the most important topics of COP26, which I will discuss soon. First, we'll talk about the urgency of COP26, why this is such an important conference. First, it's really urgent because the last conference that we were able to have on a global scale was in 2019. Because of COVID delays in 2020, we weren't able to have our COP26 last year. So this is actually 1 year delayed from when it was supposed to be. Also, another urgent point of this upcoming conference is that this past summer in August, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its most recent scientific report on the science of climate change. So we have a lot of new information that's basically confirming everything that we need to know about climate change, primarily that it's caused by humans and fossil fuels. Also, another really urgent point of COP26 is that this is the fifth COP since our Paris Agreement in 2015. We'll be talking more about that in the next few slides, but in general, COP26 is being called the world's last best chance to get runaway climate change under control. So without further ado, let's get into what the topics of COP26 will be. As I mentioned, this is the fifth COP since the Paris Agreement, and within the Paris Agreement, we have built in a 5-year accountability cycle. So the main point of COP26 is really to deliver on the Paris Agreement and the things that were included in that, including the following: to reach net zero emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We also need to prioritize climate adaptations for communities that are most affected by climate change. And we need to ensure financing for climate solutions and that wealthy industrialized nations are paying their fair share. So one of the most important discussions that will happen at COP26 will be surrounding how we can achieve net zero emissions and limit our warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Net zero emissions will be achieved when all global GHG emissions are primarily CO2, are counterbalanced by our ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So in order to do this, we need to first reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible. This will require addressing the sources of CO2 emissions, primarily fossil fuel use for the energy sector. As you can see by this graph produced by Our World in Data, that's the primary source of GHG emissions is energy. So if we're going to achieve net zero emissions, we need to stop using fossil fuels as soon as possible. Also, we need to incentivize climate solutions such as alternative energy development, global reforestation and sustainable agricultural practices, and carbon capture technologies such as direct air capture. So reducing emissions has been the primary topic of partisan debate since the first COP in 1994, and global leaders see emissions linked to economic growth and development, meaning that reducing emissions may severely harm global economies. Actually, right now, the United States House of Representatives, we are basically putting a trial to the largest US oil companies for procuring misinformation to the links of fossil fuels to climate change. We also just last week saw an article from the BBC, which had leaked documents from nations such as Saudi Arabia, Australia, and India, who are all pushing back against the COP26 demands for fossil fuel reduction, preferring carbon capture technologies. However, like I said, the first part of net zero emissions will be reducing CO2 emissions and reducing our fossil fuel use. And the purpose of this is to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is, a result of all of our use of greenhouse gases in the past. And our recent report from the IPCC illustrates the recorded data of temperature rise linked to greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts we're experiencing as a result, as well as the prediction of future catastrophe if we do not immediately reduce our emissions. So right now, we have increased atmospheric CO2 emissions that have raised the global temperature by at least 1 degree Celsius since the 19th century, leading to unprecedented weather events and global instabilities that Lauren's going to talk about in the next slide. So if we're going to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees and reach net zero emissions, we're still going to experience global catastrophe, but hopefully we can avoid some worst case scenarios. So next, I'll pass it over to Lauren to discuss the next important topic of COP26, which is the impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities.
Awesome, thank you so much, Natalie. Can you guys all hear me okay? Okay, great. So another area of focus for COP26 is prioritizing climate adaptations for communities that are most affected by climate change. The Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program defines climate vulnerability as the degree to which natural, built, and human systems are at risk of exposure to climate change impacts. Vulnerable communities experience a heightened risk and increased sensitivity to climate change, and they also have less capacity and fewer resources to cope with, adapt to, or recover from climate impacts. These disproportionate effects are caused by physical, social, political, and/or economic factors, which are then further exacerbated by climate change. So climate disasters like sea level rise and extreme precipitation can create stress on and disproportionately impact vulnerable communities, which tend to be low-income communities and communities of color. These communities are also referred to as frontline communities because they often experience the first and worst consequences of climate change, and their neighborhoods lack basic infrastructure to support them as our climate deteriorates. According to the UN General Assembly, climate, environmental degradation, and disasters increasingly have been interacting with the drivers of refugee movements to create what we call climate refugees. And these are people that are living on the front lines of climate emergencies, many of which live in climate hotspots where they lack the resources to adapt to an increasingly hostile environment. And climate disasters have already caused an average of more than 20 million people to be displaced from their homes. So what we need are more forms of environmental justice, which according to the EPA is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people when developing and enforcing environmental laws and policies. So fair treatment basically means that no group of people is going to bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences. And meaningful involvement means that communities will have an opportunity to make or influence decisions about activities that may affect their environment and or their health. So what are some local adaptation strategies? Well, one is protecting and restoring ecosystems. Ecosystems can be protected through the creation of protected areas by the government or through public and private purchases of ecologically valuable land. And then habitats are restored through management, protection, and the reestablishment of native species. And these strategies ultimately decrease ecosystem vulnerability. Another strategy is developing a more climate resilient infrastructure, Resilience could be defined as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events or trends. And climate resilience involves assessing how climate change will create new or alter existing climate related risks and taking steps to better address those risks. So, infrastructure enhancements can reduce future losses and benefit public health, safety, quality of life, and prosperity. So, it's really important to start investing in resilience up front for developing a long-lived infrastructure, because the climate of 2050 and 2100 will look very different than today. Create your account today. Please enter the last four. I'm not sure if someone else can. There we go. Sorry. So now I'm going to pass it over to Impact Team Manager Beth, who's going to discuss equitable funding for climate solutions and holding wealthy nations accountable.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. So just like Lauren said, another key focus of COP26 will be the equitable funding for climate solutions and also holding wealthy industrialized nations accountable for financing solutions in order to remedy their high contributions to global CO2 emissions. A key component of this task is climate equity. So like Lauren mentioned in the previous slide, climate change poses the greatest threat to those that are least responsible for it. And in almost every case, groups that are disproportionately affected by climate change are already vulnerable to deeply rooted societal issues, such as poverty, oppression, gender and race inequities, and more. These groups are also not as well equipped to protect themselves from the adverse effects of climate change as wealthy countries that produce higher carbon emissions. Mainstream climate solutions in the past have often focused on what we as the individual can do to reduce waste and carbon emissions in our daily lives, such as like recycling, plastic straw bans, composting, plant-based diets, etc. While these actions definitely do make a positive difference, they shift the onus of action from countries and industries that produce most of the world's pollution to the individual. Modern climate solutions need to not only establish legislation to limit our largest global carbon emission producers, but also to fight for climate justice and prioritize the needs of our most at-risk communities and nations. Past agreements have attempted to remedy climate injustice, such as the goal of the Copenhagen Accord of the COP15 in 2009. Developed countries promised to provide $30 billion in aid to developing countries between 2010 and 2012, and also to mobilize long-term financial aid of about $100 billion per year by the year 2020. The purpose of this pledge was to mandate the redistribution of national wealth to vulnerable and developing countries in order to assist them with the protection and infrastructure for inevitable climate change effects. The Paris Agreement was established at the 2015 COP21 conference, and it requires that each country prepare and maintain nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. NDCs outline efforts by each country to reduce national carbon emissions, and COP26 will be the first 5-year checkpoint where nations will be assessed on how well their NDCs have been maintained as established by the Paris Agreement. Based on each nation's performance since the establishment of the agreement, COP26 will serve as a space for nations to update and evaluate their NDC goals. I will now pass it back over to Natalie, who's going to go a little bit more in depth into the Paris Agreement expectations.
Thank you, Lauren and Beth, for all of that great information. So as Beth mentioned, the Paris Agreement is going to be a really primary focus of this upcoming conference. So we just wanted to give you some additional context on what that actually is looking like. So the intentions of the Paris Agreement were to limit global warming by 2 degrees Celsius, and also to establish these nationally determined contributions held by a 5-year accountability cycle to make sure that each participating country is pulling their fair share. However, the reality of the Paris Agreement is that it's just not living up to its expectations. Our established nationally determined contributions are actually going to bring us to 2.7 degrees of warming if everybody stays within their agreement. This is mostly because top emitters are not paying their fair share, such as the United States, China, and Russia. So another kind of challenge within approaching this deadline for the Paris Agreement is that some delays of COVID-19 have caused further challenges and also some hesitance from some important world leaders, which I'll talk about really briefly next. So COP26 is a huge moment for global leadership on climate change. We're going to see more than 30,000 people gather in Glasgow next week to participate in this conference, representing more than 200 countries and countless social and environmental interest groups from around the world. Some cause for concern comes from the uncertain attendance from two very important players, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Both of these leaders have expressed hesitance to attend due to COVID concerns, and many are worried that their lack of attendance will lead to lack of action from the Russian and Chinese governments, who together produce the large majority of global CO2 emissions. Also in recent news, Queen Elizabeth II of England, who had previously expressed real concern for COP26 and encouraging global leaders to attend, is no longer able to attend due to health concerns. So we're all wishing Queen Elizabeth the best, and she's also going to be submitting a video message for all of our world leaders who are attending. So before we get into our panel discussion, I wanted to share this quick quote from Tasneem Essop, who's the Executive Director of Climate Action Network. She basically is saying that COP26 is a moral and practical test for all of our world leaders to see if we are ready to take action to protect the generations of our future. So without further ado, let's hand it over to our panelists for today. Rachel Loss is one of our panelists today, who specializes in strategic communications for environmental nonprofits and currently works as the communications manager at the Center for Creative Land Recycling in Oakland, California. She's a graduate of Union College, where she began her environmental career by participating in a grassroots organizing training campaign with Greenpeace, starting a divestment campaign on campus, and working to bring 12 Union students to the very first Power Shift conference in Pittsburgh in 2013. After graduating, she worked on the 2014 Senate race in New Hampshire, and she's worked on a variety of environmental issues, including clean water, conservation, land use, environmental education, at organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, AmeriCorps, Student Conservation Association, and the state of Vermont. Next up, Clea Harrelson is an Ocean Science Policy Fellow with the National Science Foundation and a 2021 NOS Marine Policy Fellow. She specializes in communication from the Federal Ocean Sciences and Technology community, bridging the gap between scientists and policymakers, and developing strategic, proactive ocean policy to support healthy marine environments. She has a master's degree in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island and works as a part of the team to represent the National Science Foundation and U.S. interests internationally through groups such as G7 Future for Our Seas and Oceans Initiative. We're so happy to have you both here today. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and unmute you both, and we can jump into our first discussion question. So whoever wants to speak first, go right ahead. But our first question is regarding equity and accountability of COP26. So considering the increasing threat to vulnerable communities due to climate change, what do you think, what kind of lessons have we learned from COVID-19 that might be helpful in addressing equity and climate negotiations? And also, which communities should take top priority for climate adaptation and resilience?
I can dive in first if you want, Rachel.
Sure.
Trade off. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm excited to be speaking alongside Rachel, who has a really wonderful background in this. So we'll have a good conversation. The things that come to mind with that first question, what can we learn from COVID about how we approach climate mitigation and these strategies are really a couple of points. First, that early investment saves lives and money, right? We saw from nations who were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic with that sort of rapid, urgent set of goals and tools that they had more smooth economic recoveries, that they had lower mortality rates. I think all of those apply to climate change as well. That now is the time to act. And if we prolong our response to climate change, we also prolong the harm that we cause by allowing this to go on. I'll also just throw out too that I think quick action is possible, is something that I took away from the COVID climate sort of parallel, that we came up with trillions of dollars to respond to COVID-19 in weeks. And so if we're able to set climate change on our national agendas as a true priority, it's possible to rally resources and people quickly to respond to this. And then my final point, and then I'll turn it over to Rachel, is just that, another theme I think is, and I'll I know this is a technology-based group, so I'll explain, but I think that at times there can be sort of an overeager attitude towards technological solutions, right? And we need science and technology to front both of these issues. We need that for COVID, we need that for climate change. And also, we need to put in that work on the front end to really think about how we're changing culture and how people relate to science. One of my favorite sayings right now is relationships reduce risk. And I think that's really true of both of these. Who's sharing information about COVID, about climate change? How are we relying on and or building new relationships to make sure that when we come up with all the wonderful technology and science that we'll need to address both of these issues, that we're ready to receive it at the community level and that those pathways are already in existence. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that bridges quite nicely into the points that I was going to make, which is, I think it's a lot about trust, and I think that we've seen through COVID how, nations, we're all in this together and we're all interconnected, and when, for example, developing nations buy up all the vaccines, it can lead to problems for everyone overall, and when we put in the work to, like you said, like develop the relationship, build trust, treat each other well, I think it has huge payoffs, both with COVID and with climate. We're totally interconnected, and we need to support each other. It goes back to the agreements that Natalie and the team highlighted about, $1 billion a year for developing nations to come up with climate mitigation strategies, and that's to me a direct parallel between COVID and climate. We have to put in this effort to support developing countries because we're all in it together.
Absolutely. I'm just coming back. I realized the second part of that question was, what communities should take top priority, kind of where should we be focusing? And I'll just note that I think Lauren described a lot of that really well in her sort of, overview of equity in climate, in that one way to look at this, and I think the really the only way to look at this is through that lens of sort of intersectional layers of identity and place and economics. And so, who's already at risk, and by and by, those are the folks that are also, really where we should be focusing our efforts when we think about who to help first with adaptation and resilience strategies. How does this impact with gender, race, job, location? How is that going to impact someone's ability to recover from a disaster? All of those things. There's lots of social indices and social science work out there that really helps address that. There's a few, sort of high level examples I think you can point to in the US too. Alaska, for instance, is home to 40% of the US's federally recognized tribes. And so reduced sea ice, warming temperatures, all of the threats that come along with climate change really threaten traditional livelihoods and critical infrastructure for those communities. And so I think there are some regional focus groups and sort of communities that we do know and that federal agencies are already working with closely to help respond to climate impacts.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I'm so glad that one of your slides in this whole section was sort of prefaced with the environmental justice messaging, because I really don't think you can talk about climate. You can't be in this field without addressing environmental justice and social issues and equity and all of these good things. So it's so important to talk about this intersectionality.
Yeah, completely agree. And thank you so much. Those were incredible answers. Moving forward into our next question regarding leadership of the United States. The intense political climate of the United States has led to immense challenges when confronting the climate crisis from home. And as we speak, members of the US Senate are in a fiery debate over a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill to address climate adaptation and mitigation. And we're really struggling to reach agreement on the urgency of this crisis. So how does this affect our legitimacy as a leader in global climate conversations?
Rachel, you want to go first on this
Yeah,
one?
sure. I have lots of thoughts about this. Yeah, I mean, I think that politicians in the US are kind of trying to change the narrative, but really, I think it does erode our leadership that we can't pass things at home. And really, I mean, the negotiators who go to COP26 and show up for their countries can say all the things, but what matters is the action that takes place in each individual nation. And, you know, if the United States isn't able to show that we can have action in our country, it erodes things before even going into the negotiation. It really does. And so I think, you know, I think politicians are kind of saying it's not the end all be all. Like if we don't get it passed the next week or, you know, whatever, it can still happen. We can still make this happen, which is true. But I do think it erodes the trust for sure.
Yeah, no, I'll build on that to just agree that I think this impacts the tone of the conversation overall of what we can really bring to the table on this international stage. And also that I think, you know, it's kind of it depends and also situation, I think, because I would agree too that this infrastructure bill is not the only pathway for US leadership on climate. Although there is a tremendous amount of funding tied up in it, and it will absolutely boost and enhance our contributions to the climate fight. That, you know, it's not the only way that this is happening. And so just as a few examples through this most recent fellowship position that I'm in, I have a really wonderful vantage point of sort of all the work that goes on, regardless, that goes on in agencies. It doesn't get the same hype, I think, that these bigger negotiations often get. So, and I think this is something that harkens back even to, like, you know, what happened under previous administrations, where it seems like there was this big gap, and in many ways there was. Information was lost online, transparency, all of the things that we hopefully all know to be true about how our conversations around climate changed under Trump. But that, you know, also we passed or released, sorry, rather than passed, the fourth national climate assessment in 2018. And that came out relatively unscathed. That there's federal actions and activities and funding for long-term ocean monitoring and other sort of terrestrial monitoring systems that's been taking place for a really, really long time that all informs our current climate actions. So in a lot of ways, the science we need to make decisions, although had surface level change.
Oh no, did we lose Clea?
Clea, are you there? She was on such a roll.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
You're back.
For a minute.
Oh, good. And then recently, I'll just point out that in the Biden-Harris administration, you know, we have a couple of things that I think are sort of in the early stages that hopefully will bloom over the coming years that we can really see play out in this space. We have, you know, the first ever special presidential envoy for the climate, John Kerry. On February 11th of this past year, we had the first national climate task force meeting with National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. And then I would also bring up the UN Ocean Decade for Sustainable, UN Decade of Science for Sustainable Development. And so this is an international effort that, you know, a litany of federal agencies, nonprofits, academic institutions, all sorts of folks are engaged with. And the goal of that UN Decade, the Ocean Decade, is to catalyze the science we need for the ocean we want, but central to that is climate. And so the US is heavily invested in this event and this movement already in a way that I do think also contributes to US leadership on this front. And the UN Ocean Decade actually has 3 side events coming up at COP26, which will help, you know, highlight the ocean as a solution space for climate actions, which I'm really excited about. So there are still, you know, we're waiting to see outcomes from some of these early events, but I think we want the infrastructure bill, and also we can exhibit leadership in other ways simultaneously.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up, you know, some of the solutions that are already happening, because I also see this in my work where, you know, there's a ton of funding, you know, coming down from the federal government. There's a ton of investment happening in climate solutions already. I work primarily in land use, which relates to, various different sort of environmental issues, transportation and that sort of thing. And there's so much funding in the pipeline that it's just really exciting to see. So, it's not all doom and gloom. And I try to see that. So I appreciate your perspective.
It's just going to take time. I think it's hard too, because we want urgent actions, but I'm inspired by some of the work that's going on to build really thoughtful movements. One example that I can think of is, NOAA is a leader in dealing with coast and oceans in a lot of ways. And they've been doing, as part of their own climate sort of internal brainstorming and thinking, a whole host of roundtables in different regions that are really, I think this is just one example of how emphasis on communicating with communities is really being baked in a way that I really like, even though it doesn't quite get us the quick sort of big change that, we need also.
No,
this is helping
so
build that
important.
foundation. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's pieces, but we also need some quick, quick urgent actions to complement all of this. And
well, I think that, when you, communicate with the communities though, like you come up with better solutions in the long run. I mean, that's the key thing, is that you can either have this top-down approach where you're like bringing solutions, or you can listen to what people need and what works for them. And you'll have a shorter process. You'll have, maybe a cheaper process in the long run. It'll just be a better solution, I think. So I'm also really excited to see that. I think, the integration of environmental justice into these conversations is just, so good. So good to see.
Do you have some more to share?
No, guess we're good.
Thank you so much. I completely agree, and it's really nice, honestly, to hear these perspectives of hope, and just kind of like what good we can bring with this. So this next question is primarily directed towards you, Clea. So COP25, which was in 2019, was the first international climate conference to highlight the importance of oceans when addressing the climate crisis. And we know that this year's conference will include a lot more discussion on this. So can you give us a little bit of insight into how ocean-based solutions can contribute to climate mitigation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question, because I think oceans often get left out of climate conversations, and hopefully that's changing, but they're a huge part of how we think about the climate. You can't talk about climate in the scientific sense without understanding how oceans help regulate our climate. And so when it does get left out, it's a missed opportunity, and also a big chunk of sort of missing data, missing information that will inform other solutions. And I'll also just note that I think the buildup that you described from COP25 in 2019 to where we are now is also really important, because it shows how this landscape is changing. It's shown up in a lot of the hype for COP events. It's also shown up in the recent IUCN Conservation Congress that happened this September, obviously through the UN Ocean Decade that I just mentioned. And so many other sort of international events are starting for the first time to make oceans sort of a central feature of what they're talking about. And so the ocean relates to climate in so many ways, but I'll focus on three for today, three that I think are some of the most interesting for right now at this particular moment where we are. And the first is really thinking about oceans and energy. You described the emissions points we have to meet. You talked about net zero emissions and what it really looks like to transform our energy landscape. And offshore wind is going to be a huge way that the Biden administration tackles achieving those emissions reductions goals. And so when President Biden, just as a reminder, when he joined the Paris Climate Agreement again earlier this year, he set the goal to achieve an economy-wide target of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels, all by 2030. Right? That's where we're aiming high. And so the current goal for wind to kind of feed into this is to generate 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, enough to power 10 million homes by 2030. And that takes a huge amount of investment in infrastructure and people. And when you compare that goal to others like the UK, they have 40 gigawatts planned. China has 73 planned. It seems like, US isn't quite up to snuff. But when you think about the fact that we only had one other approved wind farm at scale off the coast of Massachusetts, which hasn't even been built yet. It's simply been approved. This change is 0 to 60. And so it's a really huge difference. And they expect to start leasing land off the East Coast primarily. There's a few slots off the West Coast as well by 2025. And so all of that's happening quite quickly for this typical pace of change for that type of permitting and lease process. We're also exploring ways on the ocean kind of energy side to support decarbonization of shipping and maritime transport, which is a large contributor to like the overall pie chart slice of what transportation contributes to climate change emissions. I'll secondly say that I think oceans really relate to climate mitigation through what are broadly referred to as nature-based solutions. So lots of folks are talking about 2030, the effort to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. It's an international target that the US has adopted. And in general, you can just think of nature-based solutions as the restoration and protection of coastal and ocean ecosystems. And the reason that's so cool and so important to think about and to prioritize is that these ecosystems, when you picture things like mangroves, seagrass, meadows, kelp forest, all of those sorts of places, have been found to be about 10 times more effective at sequestering carbon than on-land forest, right? So this is a place when we're thinking about where we want to prioritize conservation efforts, where we can really make a big impact for big bang for our buck. And then finally, I'll just say, I think the oceans actually play also a really important role in equity in this whole conversation we've been having. About 40% of the entire world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. That's a number that gets cited all the time. And so that means that people in coastal areas often feel the first impacts of extreme events and have really tight knit relationships with the ocean for food security and for other sort of more large scale concerns like national defense. So all of that ties into how we think about climate change and who's on the receiving end of benefits and impacts. And then also because there's these other big industries and movements building related to offshore wind, nature-based solutions, all of the industries and the scientific sort of enterprises that will support those, this is the opportunity to, as I said before, I think bake in equity and justice concerns into those processes as they're being developed. And so, you know, who's really getting wind energy jobs? Where are we siting new facilities? What communities are we investing in to protect their coastlines? All of those things matter. None of that happens by accident, right? That's all related to historic processes and ongoing processes of that relate to race and gender and geographic location and politics and all sorts of things. And so we can be really intentional here. And I think the oceans are really well set up at this moment in time with all the international domestic attention to be part of how we think about climate change, both at scale and in those local community settings.
What I really liked about your three-pronged answer was, you know, it kind of goes back to like technology and what you said earlier about technology and kind of how, you know, there's existing technology, you know, we don't even have to change that much. Like maybe we tweak things to make them better over time, but, you know, really we have solutions that work, and we know that protecting the mangrove forests and protecting the kelp forests, you know, helps to sequester, you know, we know that this exists and that it works. And, you know, they've done studies about kind of like existing technology and solutions to show that, you know, different models of what we can implement and what solutions we can do to reach our goals. And so I like that you highlighted those three things.
Yeah, thank you so much, both to Clea and to Rachel, for kind of, giving us some more context on how that can play into our climate mitigation approach. Rachel, this question is more directed towards you, but of course, Clea, feel free to chime in.
Yeah.
I know that you have worked a lot in the field of science communication, so I'd like to hear a little bit more of your perspective on how, like, what kind of role does science communication play in climate mitigation and promoting environmental justice?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, really. So I'll hit on a couple different things. But I mean, to be honest, I just think that communication is not to be underestimated. I think that it's so critical to every field and to, every issue area and to, everything that we're trying to accomplish, just depends on effective and good communication. So that's, why I'm passionate about this work. And so, to me, communication is kind of a couple of different things. It's education, it's advocacy, and it's it's policy, really. So effective communication can lead to good and important advances on, I think, each of those fronts. Like obviously, as we've been hearing in sort of the national conversation for 5 years now, it's so important to have policy that is reflecting the most current science and what we know. So obviously kind of translating the science into effective policy is one really important avenue, but also educating the public and kind of, again, like translating the science into things that are becoming more commonly understood. And while you're doing that, really making sure that the implications of the science are coming across, not that it's just facts and figures, but it's, what does this mean? How are we talking about what this means, and what conclusions can we draw, and how do we move forward? And so the moving forward piece is also something that I'm passionate about, which is advocacy. And, how do we, again, kind of make sure that we're finding solutions and bringing solutions and pushing for urgent solutions as we need to be at this time. Yeah, I guess I'll kind of stop there and see if Clea wants to jump in.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great setup. And I just feel like so much of it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about trust too.
Mhm.
There's some poll that I read recently that was something like 65% of Americans think that the federal government is doing too little to address climate change. I think that was a Pew study in 2020. But when you think about, okay, well, what does it take to actually address climate change equitably? That requires the people and the trust aspects that you were talking about to actually implement it. And how do you build trust? Through good early communication that's consistent and transparent. And I feel like, yeah, that piece is, I've worked in a number of NGO settings and academic settings and government settings. I can't tell you how, like, it's not surprising anymore, but it still pains my heart when you realize that in all of those settings, the communications department is the most like underfunded, sort of undervalued aspect of their work.
Undervalued for sure.
Yeah.
And again, like we're just, what do we do all day, every day? We read, we talk, we interact with each other. It's all communication. And so when you think about strategies to make that work better, of course it's gonna improve science and improve academia and improve, our policies and that sort of thing. So yeah.
And that it's a science in and of itself. I think there's this assumption that because we talk and we have some basic forms of communication that we use in our everyday lives, that's what communication equals, and that people who do comms work are then just, doing everyday work.
Chatting.
Yeah, they're just chatting, or they're doing everyday work in a way that's completely unrealistic. And that the true strategy of how events like COP26, the buildup, the discussion around COP26, that's like a strategic communications masterpiece. That's the type of marketing and science communication and like you were saying, translating the actual impacts to people. I think all of that sets the stage for what actually happens with climate change in a really big way that we haven't fully reckoned with science communication, although lots of people want to now at this stage.
Yeah, I think it is a hot topic in and of itself, for sure. I think it's becoming ever more important and urgent to really, scientists used to be sort of siloed in their own, academic world, and it's not even possible anymore, because, I think, it's just not possible for someone to just do research and then be like, oh yeah, here's the paper, like that doesn't exist. And so I think, it's definitely a really important topic.
Thank you both so much. And I think that's a really great point to transition. That's exactly what we're trying to do with this COP26 Climate Action Marathon, is to make this information a little bit more digestible, a little bit more accessible to the general public. So just want to give a huge shout out to everyone who came out today to learn more about it. I think that's also a really important part of it, is to gather this community excitement around these topics and promote conversation around these events, because if we don't participate, then things are going to happen without us knowing. So yeah, thank you so much to Clea and Rachel for those amazing insights. I'm so grateful you're able to join us today. It is 3:45, so it's time to transition into just a really quick conclusion. We're going to be talking about how we can address this issue of equity and climate mitigation through community solar. So here at Common Energy, we work with climate mitigation through a state program called Community Solar, which incentivizes the addition of solar farms to local utility grids. This is not only a great way to reduce carbon emissions, but it also opens the world of renewable energy to more people than ever before. I'm going to pass it over to our impact team manager, Beth, to share a little bit more information about how this works.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Community solar is a new form of clean energy that allows for households to connect to local community solar farms without the cost of rooftop installation. Community solar farms can create clean electricity by converting energy from the sun into electricity using photovoltaic cells. The energy from these farms can then be connected to the utility, where it can be used in place of fossil fuels. From the utility, the clean electricity enters the local grid as normal and flows to all consumers, including homes, businesses, schools, etc. Households that decide to participate in this greening of the grid will receive savings on their monthly utility bill as an incentive from the state to divest from fossil fuels. There are so many reasons to sign up today. The first of these being the positive environmental impact that you as an individual can make. By signing up with Common Energy, you can prevent approximately 100,000 pounds of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere every single year, which is the equivalent to planting 20 trees, which is just an amazing impact. Not only will you be taking a step away from fossil fuels, but you will also be saving money every single month by participating. Signing up is free, it's really easy to do, and you can participate even if you rent your home. If you pay the utility bill, you can qualify. You can also cancel at any time if you decide the program is not for you. There are no long-term contracts or hidden fees, just a passion for creating a healthier planet and future. We are active in the 9 states listed here, and if you feel ready to enable clean energy to enter the grid for free, please go ahead and sign up with the link below. We'll be posting it in the chat as well, and we would be happy to stay on after the call is over to answer any questions you might have about our program. So on that note, on behalf of the Common Energy Impact Team, thank you so much for joining today's discussion. These climate change discussions are so educational and important, and I'm so grateful that we can all share the same goal of equitable climate mitigation. Our next installation of the COP26 Climate Action Marathon will be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on November 18th, and we'll be discussing the COP26 conclusions and action steps. A special thank you again to our speakers and our audience for your participation today. And we look forward to continuing this discussion at our next event. In the meantime, if you have any questions about this event or our upcoming series, please email Natalie at her email on the screen there, natalie.lana@commonenergy.us. And with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you all so much for joining today.
Thank you, Beth. So if anyone is interested in signing up for Community Solar, please go ahead and visit that link. You can find more information there. You can also reach out if you have any questions. I'd also like to open it up to see if anyone has any questions, either for us or for Clea or for Rachel. I will give you the ability to unmute yourself now. Here you go. Question in the chat. Can we find the recording anywhere? Yes, I will be posting the recording on YouTube later today, so I'll send that out to all of our participants. As long as you filled out the attendance form, you'll definitely get this recording. And you can always find the recordings of our previous events as well on our YouTube page. Our YouTube handle is just Common Energy Impact Team. So if you search that, you can find all of our previous events as well. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but we can stay on for a little bit more in case anybody has an additional question. We'll just, how do I stop the recording? Here we go.